to episode 2 of Mindset, sponsored by Mind the Product Training. I'm your host, Rosemary King, Director of Training Products at Mind the Product. Each session, Mindset takes questions from our product community and discusses them with one of our expert guests and trainers. And hopefully what we can provide to you is a helpful new way of thinking about your challenge, some free resources to check out, and maybe some pathways to some deeper skills development as well. If you find Mindset helpful, please feel free to share it with the product people in your life, and hopefully they'll find it helpful too. So we are in back to school time at this stage. Everybody's kind of straggling back from vacation, getting their heads back into the game. And I think for us at Mind the Product Training, it's a big time for skills development. We get lots of questions, tons more inquiries about in-house trainings and people wanting to come to the workshops. Everybody's kind of back in business mode. I know that even though I'm in my mid-30s now, I still have very much a back-to-school mindset of like, okay, what do I need to improve upon? What do I want to focus on? And where my head has been at over the last couple of weeks, many months, but really in the last couple of weeks, because we've been working on finishing a new workshop that we're about to release on mapping. And so I've been thinking a lot about mapping as a practice. I've been thinking a lot about systems thinking and how it affects product managers. And I've been thinking a lot about mental models and how we can use visualizations and different collaborative ways of building information models to help us grasp complexity in our lives. And the thing is as I was looking at the questions for this session, all of them really struck me that all of us in product development are constantly thinking about how to improve systems and improve processes, whether that be with our teams, whether that be with our organizations, whether that be with our products. We just are never in a situation where we don't have to think about how complexity affects the systems that we're working in. And that actually affects our users too. We've got society, culture. So there are so many different systems that we're always trying to parse. And so I'm really excited to kind of think about that theme as we tackle some of the questions that we've received from you over the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to bring our wonderful guest on. His name is Eli Montgomery. Your Twitter handle is Silva, which always really confuses me.
We'll work on that.
Why don't you come on and join us? Eli is the head of user experience at Cazoo.
That's right.
So why don't you tell us what you've been up to at Cazoo lately?
This is week 4.
Week 4, so you've just started?
Yeah, so I just started.
Amazing.
Week 4.
How's it going?
It's full on.
Yeah?
There's a lot going on.
I mean, actually, this is a really interesting question for folks, because we've actually gotten this a lot. Like, what's the most important thing you always try to do when you started a new organization? Like, what would you sort of recommend to folks who are kind of wiggling into a new role, or maybe even just joining a new team in an organization that they've worked at for a while?
Yeah, I think it's really important to start to understand like what's important, what's in flight. So this is a brand new team and they've kind of been building it over the last few months. So thinking in systems, which is our topic today, is actually really important. Understanding what's there, what is this system like? Who's working on it? What does that feel like?
Yeah.
What are we currently aiming for? Mm-hmm. Who's in charge of that? How do we know what good looks like?
Yeah.
So those are some of the kinds of questions I've been asking, and my boss went on holiday and left me, figuring things out on my own for 2 weeks, and that was challenging but fun, because it kind of meant that I could just get up to my elbows in information and just start asking some questions and building relationships. So the first few weeks at any job always look like lots of coffee meetings, lots of like, hey, what does your team do? How should I loop you in on these things? What are you aiming for? What's the most important thing you're trying to accomplish in the next 90 days? That sort of thing. Yeah. Just to start really understanding what is this system and are people generally aligned or not? And that's kind of where I start a diagnosis of like, what's my playbook for getting things done, right? Because it's really important to understand where people are at, what they're aiming for, and whether that's working for them or not.
Yeah, I love a good round of stakeholder interviews. I think it can surface so much in terms of how a product manager needs to move through the organization. If in those stakeholder interviews that you're doing, you hear a lot of the same things, that's actually really great, because it means that people are aligned, they're all pulling towards the same thing. It's always a little bit of a red flag when you're like, wow, there's a couple people who are really out over here and a few people who are over here, but not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It just means that you need to understand how to navigate that and make sure that, if your priorities for your product are going to serve this group, you need to make sure that you still maintain a connection or relationships with maybe folks who are not necessarily served by your current priorities, but maybe served down the line. So I think stakeholder interviews are an amazing strategic skill for product managers to develop as part of their practice. And it should just be, as you say, like muscle memory. It should be the first thing that you kind of get into doing, is getting that lay of the land.
Absolutely. So we have a head of CRM, and her particular team isn't actually going to be part of the initial release of what we're launching this year at Cazoo. She'll be there probably before the end of the year, but not just yet.
Yeah.
So, looping her in, giving her a little bit of information on what's coming next, when she can expect, when she'll be looped in for things, can set really good expectations, and it can kind of make that whole process easier.
Yeah.
But it is really important to just get a lay of the land and understand how different people's motivations and relationships are working towards the common goal.
Yeah, awesome. I think setting expectations is the headline for anything to do with stakeholders. It's just put that in air quotes and just have that be the thing that you always try to remember to do.
Absolutely.
Amazing. I'm so happy you're here today. You ready to answer some questions from the community?
Yeah, let's do it.
Whoop, let's do it. Okay, cool. So the first question we have today is from Neil, and we're going to be tagging these questions so that we can kind of section them up and make them more findable for you. So this is lead testing 1. And the question is how to define MVP for a late mover product in an enterprise segment. So a very kind of technical question. I think it's really interesting when you're asked these questions and you don't have a ton of context. I think there's so much information that I would kind of want around this question before I could probably give a really specific answer. But I think it's really fascinating to grapple with the term MVP in this day and age, because I feel like that term has evolved so much in the last couple of years. And I think it's also really interesting to couple that with the concept of a late mover product. So this is a product that is joining a market that I'm assuming is quite busy. So maybe say
Zoom
would be a big one, or anything to do with ride sharing, I think would be considered a late mover product, because Uber is so dominant, but then you also have Lyft and Grab and Get and all of those different things. So I think it's fascinating to think about defining an MVP for a late mover product. So you've got a market that's really full. You have customer expectations very much set. You have things that used to be maybe delighters, 10 years ago when Uber came out, that are now 100% expected. And I think we've learned a lot about the market, or fingers crossed you've learned a lot about the market. Again, I don't know what this late mover product is. I have no idea what the domain is. So I think I would probably start with a really in-depth competitor analysis to understand kind of what where all of your competitors fell on the grid. And then I'd probably want to do a round of user research to watch potential target customers use a competitor product and see what that type of behavior looks like. I think getting a sense of what's expected, what current behaviors are really important, because I think for a late mover product, you would need to understand, okay, well, what's our differentiator, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. The one big word, you said it right there at the end, that I would be looking for is differentiation, right? So what is it that customers aren't getting out of that experience. Like, it actually is probably more helpful at this stage to just park the term MVP and never use it again.
I agree.
And throw it in the product graveyard.
Yeah, I think so. I think the utility of the term MVP has reached its limit, because I think when people start focusing on the MVP, I think it focuses on the wrong stuff generally, and I'm not necessarily sure I can characterize why. It's just what I've observed with folks. I think really what you're attempting to do is figure out how to fill value that's currently not being met. And that's really the thing that you should stay focused on generally.
Yeah, absolutely. MVPs are so fraught with danger. I mean, there's landmines everywhere. People are like, this is the first release of the product, or it's, just an experiment, or it's something in between, or it's a hybrid. And it carries a lot of baggage as a term. And when you don't have that alignment, you find yourself in this place where people maybe have different interpretations. Somebody's like, right, the MVP is our go-to-market strategy, or it's our initial launch, or it's, something that we know is broken, but we're going to fix it later. And when you find that people are trying to converge on this term MVP, there's almost so many interpretations that it's not helpful anymore.
I agree.
So talking about things that are a little bit more tactical, like a go-to-market strategy, or a initial product release, or a product hypothesis, or a prototype, or a test, those kinds of things are actually much better. And I think where we were 10 years ago, MVP made sense because the industry didn't have those kinds of terms around small tests, right? But now we do have that language, and we can kind of go, right, MVP is an umbrella for those things, is not necessarily useful anymore.
I agree. I think we have to be more surgical about how we think about
building. Like that.
Yeah, I use that term a lot. I think, especially in product development, I think people sort of take sledgehammers and try to use them as scalpels. And it's like, you can't expect a term to make your toast for you. I think you need to make sure that you're differentiating where you're at, the context of your product, and find the right tool for the right position. I think the thing that we're always talking about at Mind the Product Training is like the product role, any role you're in, whether it be user experience, UX, UI, product management, engineering, it's all about filling your tool set or your toolbox with the right set of tools, and then understanding and being able to extract the right tool for the right time. And as you say, I think MVP is an umbrella term, and there are now so many finer tools underneath that umbrella that are so much more useful for us, and I think so much more useful for the organization. So I think getting back to the question, I think, defining what you initially need in order to release and grab a foothold in a crowded market is really how you want to characterize what it is that your organization is trying to do. And I think figuring out the differentiator is usually the first step. Again, what isn't being met, what need isn't being met, where is there friction or a challenge that your customers are grabbing? Is there an ungrabbed opportunity that your competitors are not doing? I think these are questions that you want to be able to answer. What do you think about the concept of using a canvas in this circumstance? I always think that it's helpful to give yourself a little bit of a rail.
Yeah, one of the tools I really like for thinking about how you deliver value is, I was going to say two things. I think the Kano model is extremely helpful because it kind of helps you as a product understand what's basic expectation, but then go out and test that with people and see which features are being used and which aren't, right? I worked on a product a few years ago where the client was in healthcare and they wanted to ship basically a call center management tool to help them speed through getting orders across their system. And one of the things that they said when we were first scoping the project was, we don't really need design. We kind of know what works about the system. We don't really need somebody to just polish this and make it pretty. And I kind of lost it a little bit.
Cute, yeah.
it was one of those moments where like life freezes. You know, my hand came down on the table and I just went, listen. And I was like, oh, I might get fired for this.
You know what?
And I kind of had to walk
time.
it back, but I was like, look, you don't hire a designer just to make it pretty. You hire us to really understand where the value is here.
Yeah.
And there's this book I read this year called The Art of Business Value. And it touches on lots of things about understanding value and how is value defined. I can't remember the author for the life of me, I'm sorry.
We'll look it up. Laura, we can look it up.
But in The Art of Business Value, you kind of start understanding that value is this intangible term that we in product and tech tend to take for granted. Mm-hmm. And we go, right, there's value here, there isn't, or, you know, what is value? How do we define it? And that's actually going to depend based on who you work with, what you're trying to achieve, and how soon you need to achieve it.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you're looking at trying to define a product in a crowded market, where is the value, both for you as a business and for the customer? And if you start with that customer, where are they being hampered? Where are those points of friction? Where are things not streamlined? Mm-hmm. Where could you know, maybe add delight? They mentioned that it's enterprise, so maybe it's just efficiency, right? Sometimes the delight is actually just, I have to use your system and it sucks, but maybe it's the fastest, less sucky system to use. And sometimes that's it. That's the value.
It definitely rings true for any sort of like receipt or expense program that we all have to use and for our businesses. But I think the Cazoo model is a really helpful structure when you're moving into a crowded market. We teach it in our Essentials program. And I do think as a prioritization model, it really only has utility in these kinds of conversations when you're sort of blue sky thinking or entering a new market, because it is so expansive and it has the ability to kind of capture the width and breadth of a marketplace. It's not great when you're thinking about like backlog planning. So don't try to use it for that. But I think it, as a strategy framework, I think it's a really, really helpful tool.
100%
So I'm really
agreed.
glad that you brought up the Cazoo model. Cool. I hope that answers your question. Let's move on to question 2, shall we? Okay, question number 2 is from Jason. This is scaling 1. What are good examples of companies who have effectively scaled their product organizations with multiple levels of product managers, parentheses, POs, PMs, directors, etc.? So I think this question is fascinating. I actually wrote a blog. I get so many questions around product owner versus product manager that I wrote a blog about how, in my opinion, the titles really don't matter. So product owner versus product manager, those titles have arisen out of 2 product development frameworks, Scrum versus Agile. So if your organization is running a Scrum framework, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a product owner. Now, in Scrum, the concept is that product owners should be an autonomous role that are able to make decisions and prioritize their product and push things forward. Now, the problem is most enterprise companies aren't equipped to necessarily endow that role with that level of autonomy. And so what they did is they have the product owner kind of at that ground level, running the backlog, you know, watching, you know, what is delivered per week via the delivery team. And then there's a hierarchical role that has been imposed above them called the product manager, who's handling a lot of the stakeholder management, strategic aspects of the role. And sometimes that's simply because of capacity. The product owner could just be that busy. So that's kind of where that hierarchy thing goes. Product owner a little bit lower level, product manager above. Now, fortunately, we live in a world filled with complexity. Again, systems. And so this is connecting to organizational systems. And a lot of times in Agile, the product manager is the person kind of playing that ground level game. And for instance, when I worked at Pivotal Labs, I was a product manager running the team, running the backlog, setting priority. And we were a consultancy. So we would have client sort of counterparts who would basically be making the final call on the product. And we called them product owners. So all of this is to say, a long story short, there are no hard and fast rules in terms of what the term product owner versus product manager means. And what I say in my blog is that what organizations should really be clear about is what are the outcomes that the roles are attempting to push forward. Is the outcome of the product owner role that there's a transparency around what is prioritized for the sprint that week, that there's an understanding as to what risk or dependencies are there and he's surfacing them or she's surfacing them. Are product managers meant to make sure the organization is aligned or that things are communicated and that, again, sort of out there doing a lot of that alignment strategy piece. Organizations need to understand what the roles are intending to do so that they can kind of set that structure accordingly. Have you had a lot of experience in working in a PO versus PM world or PM world situation?
Yes and.
Yes and. Oh, I love that. Yes,
yes and.
Very improvisational.
Yes, and I don't know that anyone does this particularly well.
No one does. Literally, we work with, Netflix, Spotify, New York Times, Amex, blah, 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 blah. You lift the head on, or you lift the, what is it called, boot, trunk, on
the bonnet
on any of these organizations, and what you're going to find is good teams and bad teams, and you're going to find process unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. I think this concept of perfect just doesn't exist.
No.
Anywhere.
I've seen teams, I've been a consultant and I've worked in-house as well, yeah. And I've seen teams try to go, the Netflix model, let's do that. Or the Spotify model.
Everyone wants the Spotify model.
Let's go do that. We
okay.
want guilds. And it's there are literally 6 of you sitting in a garage. You don't need a guild. Or, on the other hand, it's you're a really big company and somebody wants to be the change agent. They want to be the champion of that. And I think a more helpful way to think about doing this right is aligning people to outcomes. Because you can spin your wheels going, okay, let's tweak this process. Let's appoint this person a champion of this or a champion of that, or segment the roles and maybe they're culture champs or agile coaches even. And I think there's just a lot of faff about it. And what you get is people who are more focused on the agile transformation or the digital transformation at the expense of actually generating the business outcomes that will sustain those outcomes, right? So companies who tend to do this well, there's mixes, right? Because it depends on the team and the chemistry. I think when I'm looking for inspiration of companies who are serving at scale and serving real product outcomes, I look at companies like Intercom, Slack, I think have done a really great job. A new upstart that seems to be doing pretty well so far is Notion.
Yeah, Notion does amazing. I think TransferWise,
Monzo,
for sure, absolutely.
And I think that there are hits and misses within each of those companies, right? So if we talk to anybody at any of those companies that we just listed, surely not everything is duckies and bunnies and roses. It's not without challenge, right? Software is hard. That's actually one of my very first principles for understanding a system is assume that software is hard.
Assume that this is going to be difficult and complex. Well, getting back to our theme of systems thinking and sort of process engineering, this is getting to absolutely the heart of that conversation. Maybe the first thing that any organization who's thinking about imposing a new role or a different role or moving more to a product management perspective should process map what's happening currently in their organization and being able to pinpoint where there are inflection points and friction points and where information seems to be getting lost or where it seems to be getting parked or where it pools or where it's held. And I think if you can, as an organization, visualize that and then sort of say, well, our hypothesis is that this role will alleviate that friction or this role will move this information forward, then all of a sudden you have role clarity. So I think process mapping is a really wonderful exercise for any organization, especially big enterprises who need to recognize that nothing happens in isolation. If you're introducing a role, that's going to have a domino effect all the way down, for sure.
I got a question from somebody that I've been coaching the last few months, and they were like, I'm having a really hard time understanding how I can have more influence in my organization and how I can, move things forward. It feels like we're only brought to the table at the very last minute as, both design and product management. And I was like, cool. How do decisions get made? And,
Lovely.
one of
What
the things
a good question to answer for any product manager. Every product manager should know that the answer to that question for their organization. How do decisions at your organization get made?
Yep.
For sure. Sorry to interrupt.
It's all good. One of the things that I encouraged this person to do was just really understand and make a map and go, okay, this is where a decision starts, or this is where an idea starts, and then how do you follow that through from idea to implementation, and who was responsible for that, who was involved, where did it pull, where did it slow down, where were the points of friction, if you're in an enterprise, what was sign off like.
Yeah.
And understanding that kind of gives you room to determine your plan of attack, because there's no easy answer, right?
Yeah.
But it's really about, if you understand the system, you can understand where the points of friction are, and you can understand where maybe you can grease the wheels, or if there's things that are flowing too quickly, maybe you can introduce some healthy friction to slow things down and put in the right input and
Or
checks.
gates. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you need checks. Sometimes you actually do need to slow the info down, for sure. Amazing. Question number 3. What is the best way to conduct a competitive analysis? This question comes from Chris, evaluating opportunity 1. So we actually teach competitor analysis in one of our modules for our essentials workshops. So Mind the Product really believes that there's no one right way to do this. So we teach a couple of different aspects of competitor analysis. I feel like there's dozens and dozens and dozens of ways of coming at this. So I'd love to hear from your experience, Eli. Like, what has been one way that you've found to be really effective for thinking about kind of the competitor landscape?
I think the very first question that I ask is, who is the customer?
Who is the customer is your very first question
That's
to
the
answer.
very first question I ask. And the reason for that is who your customer is actually has a really big impact on who your competitors are.
Yeah.
Because,
That's
at
right.
Cazoo, we're basically going for a very specific market segment. And there are lots of people in the used car game, both aggregators and, dealerships that are going online. And so one of the things to set priority on is like, who are the competitors who are closest to us, either in service offering because they're going for similar customers, or who are targeting our demographics. And maybe we can see that by the way they're spending money on ads, or by the way that, their search results are playing out in AdWords, right? So understanding who your customer is actually really important to that competitive analysis piece, because if you understand your customer, maybe nobody is actually serving the customer that you've identified.
Yeah.
Or if other people are, how do you compete sideways from
Yeah.
them? How do you hit them at an angle that they're not expecting?
Yeah.
And sort of capture that market share and bring people into your fold, right? So it's all about healthy competition, and knowing who your customer is can really give you a lot of insight. But that's the first question I ask. The next thing I do is I take a look at, who are those companies? What are they doing? What are they saying? What is their, mantra, if you will, or their motto? And then what does their design look like? What does their research look like? Can we get any of that? Can we see what they're really like as companies? And then what are our points of differentiation? It's as important to know yourself and your company. So if you're brand new, spend some time with the brand team. Spend some time understanding what your points of differentiation are.
Yeah.
And dig into that, because you might not want to serve that customer in the same way. And whether you're, product owner, entry level 1, or the head of product or the chief product officer, spend some time understanding what the organization's approach to differentiation is, and what their approach to their customer service is going to be.
Yeah.
And I think start there.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about like brand teams, marketing teams. I think depending on the age of your organization and how much work that they've done, there's some really helpful resources that I think are available. I think, one of the things always getting back to the systems thinking thing because I'm just like eye deep in it. But as you were talking, I was thinking this is so the place for a user journey map. Like once you sort of identified, using the metaphor of a bicycle, bicycles can serve everyone. You can have a 2-year-old on a bicycle, you can have a Lance Armstrong on a bicycle, you can have everybody in between. I personally am not on a bicycle because I'm an incredible klutz, but you know what I mean. So I think if you can, once you've identified that target customer for you, being able to track their journey into and out of your product experience is so incredibly helpful to understand, again, where there are friction points potentially. And you can do it from 2 different perspectives. You can do a user journey map in terms of their current experience, or you can create one for a blue sky experience. Yep. And sometimes I think it's fascinating to understand the competitor landscape. And when I was getting started at Mind the Product, we did a competitor analysis and it was great. But actually the thing that I found most helpful for us was a blue sky thinking user journey map for a service that didn't exist yet. It's like, what do we want to create here? And then it gives you something to measure against. Because I think sometimes as product people, we can become very concerned with what is happening in the landscape. And you absolutely do need to keep half an eye on that at all times. But you should not let that drive your priority.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I'm kind of at a point where a lot of people sort of say, oh, these guys are doing training and these guys are doing training. And I'm kind of like, that's cool. We don't really even know where the bounds of the market are yet for this business. And I'm kind of like, we're just going to keep kicking on with what we're doing because you have to stay focused on what you're doing. So I think while understanding what's happening with competitors is really important, it should not be the thing that drives you.
Absolutely. I think one of the companies that does a really good job at this is Amazon.
Oh,
actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't overly focus on customers. It is half an eye or less, right? Or on competitors rather.
Yeah.
They're obsessed with customers.
They're obsessed with customers, not as obsessed with competitors. Yeah.
Because your customers are going to be different, right?
Yeah.
Simon Sinek in Starts With Why talks about finding the people who believe what you believe. If you're pushing a new product to market or a new message, right? You want to find the people who believe what you believe.
Great book. I love Starts With Why.
And you don't need to sell your product to everyone, right?
Yeah.
Your product is made for a target audience. Actually, a bicycle is really great as an analogy.
It's
I'm
so
going to use
great.
it from now on.
Please.
Because you have a 2-year-old, you have Lance Armstrong, you have commuters, you have casual bikers.
You have fitness buffs, exactly.
And everything in between. Yeah. And there's just a broad range, right?
Yeah.
And your customers are going to depend, and your competitors may or may not be after the same market as you.
Exactly.
And everything from price point to what your brand is and your brand promise and your unique differentiators can weigh in. And so when you're thinking about competitive analysis, never get stuck in just looking at logos and, websites for competitors. You have to think in terms of your own system of like, there are various stakeholders involved in this question of who are my competitors, and you have to gather that information and kind of like refine that institutional knowledge into something that actually gives you direction. Yeah.
We talk about a competitor analysis matrix in Essentials, and it's really about sort of tabulating, like brand, tone, sometimes emotion.
Yeah.
What are the emotions that your competitors are driving out of the customers that you want or don't want, etc. Like, what kind of experience do you want to provide to people? Just being able to tabulate all of those. I think what you're trying to do with competitor analysis is find holes on the landscape, essentially, for you to be, especially if you're moving into a crowded market, but not necessarily all the time. Sometimes you can just go in and do it better.
Zoom,
100% Zoom, absolutely. So this question's from Chad. Roadmap 1. Are there strategic frameworks as to how to come up with a roadmap for the quarter and how to prioritize them internally? Okay. So here's the thing about roadmaps is that I am actually not a huge proponent of them. I actually always said that when I was a more classic product manager, and I actually have roadmaps now. I have a roadmap that I follow as director of training. I used to say I didn't really need a physical artifact or like a digital roadmap because I was the roadmap. As product managers, we should have such an intrinsic sense of why we're doing things for our customers, that we like, it kind of like lives within us, you know, it's sort of like always bubbling under the surface. But I get it, like, you know, you do need to kind of get that out so that you can sense check it and that you can, you know, shop it around. But I feel like the whole industry of product development right now is looking at roadmaps from the wrong perspective. A roadmap is an output, right? It's an output of a process. If you are not running that process, then you cannot build an effective roadmap. And so the process that we're talking about, of course, as you very much know, is a user-driven process that balances qualitative and quantitative research and uses that to create priorities that are constantly reassessed. And that's the way that your output of a roadmap is built. What I see constantly is that roadmaps are simply kind of like chunked down based off of some sort of like massive requirements document. And basically it's kind of that requirements document chopped up into, you know, kind of, I have no idea how people prioritize that stuff, except that it's like whatever, you know, stakeholder seems to want. And then it's just argued over, you know, in a sort of a never-ending opinion fight. And it really, it drives me absolutely bananas. I think a roadmap, when it is an output of, you know, a well-honed, user-driven process, it can be an exceptional alignment tool, a discussion tool, an amazing way of surfacing risk and misalignment. But if you're not doing that user-driven process, it is a farce. And I know that this is probably really controversial, but you know, that's how I feel about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I 100% agree. I think roadmaps, like user research, if you're going to do it poorly, you might as well just not do it.
100%.
A roadmap to me is the artifact of shared understanding.
Yeah.
And if you don't use a roadmap as a way to sense check and create shared understanding, then you're not using a roadmap effectively or right. Don't put dates on your roadmap.
Please don't put dates on your roadmap. I know. We actually have a massive, you know, 2.5-hour module on roadmaps because they are such a complex, you know, artifact. And in order to build them effectively, you do, like, basically we have 7 modules that lead into that 2.5-hour module.
Yeah.
And it's not really something that you can kind of teach on a standalone basis. Like, you can't just come in and be like, here's how you build your roadmap. And I think folks who want that silver bullet, you know, are kind of living in more of a Gantt chart world, sort of not the user-driven, like agile, constant learning environment. So I think separating like the artifact from the process is something that we really need to stop doing as an industry generally.
Yeah, I think a roadmap, if it works, is an artifact that reflects 3 things, right? The first one is shared understanding. Mm-hmm. The second one is bets or strategic learning goals.
I love it.
And then the third thing is alignment, right? So like shared understanding and alignment are actually 2 different factors, because people can have a shared understanding and still want very different things. Mm-hmm. So keeping shared understanding intact is really important, but you also have to make sure that there's alignment. You know, a roadmap kind of helps you do both. Yeah. And then bets. John Cutler's been doing a lot of talk about how to think about bets, and I would highly recommend his work.
Where's John Cutler work again? I love that guy.
Amplitude.
That's right.
Yeah,
Amplitude.
he's at Amplitude.
Yeah.
He's the head of product at Amplitude.
Head of product. He spoke at our first Hamburg Engage.
Yeah.
And I was able to meet him there, and he's a very sharp guy.
Yes.
And I really like a lot of the dialogue he introduces into like the ether. I think it's very good.
So one of the things that I've been, you know, coaching the teams that I've worked with over the last few years on is like, we should think of a roadmap and think of this road mapping process as like bets. Or I was chatting to somebody a few months ago about, you know, they were like, I've kind of reached the end of my backlog and I don't know what my roadmap should be next. And I was like, what are your learning goals? Yeah. What are you trying to learn next?
That's great.
And I think that a roadmap is as much about, you know, like, yes, we have these features that we want or these ideas, right? But it's really customer outcomes should drive the roadmap, right? Yeah, it's not about, introduce a fix to the login screen. It's actually about what is the customer outcome you're trying to solve. And it's really important to have the discipline to think about that outcome and what it can do for your business, right? Road mapping is not just a change this UI or fix this little bit or,
That's
marginally
a
enhance.
FYI, guys, that's a backlog. Like
Yes.
those tiny little feature changes, that's your backlog. That's not your roadmap. And I think there's so much confusion around like the utility of these things. I think a lot of things are called roadmaps that are not roadmaps, which drives me crazy. What I love about the way you're talking about this is it sort of overlays. So when we talk about product roadmaps in our module, we talk about now, next, later.
Yep.
And I think the three tenets that you discussed, so alignment, shared understanding, bets, and then alignment. And so I think you can kind of overlay those three buckets on top of that now, next, later concept. So you can say shared understanding is what we're doing now. We all understand that this is what we need to be working on now because we've done all the due diligence and rigor in order to get to that shared understanding. The next is the bets that we're currently testing. These are things that are coming up that we're in the process of testing with users, of doing research on, of putting things in front of customers. And then the alignment piece is, where do we want to go?
Yep.
Are we aligned on where we want to go? And do we all agree that that's the right direction for our business? And so I love the way that you just, so brilliant, but like exactly what you just said sort of overlays the way that we teach the now, next, later, structure of product roadmaps. But I do think that we sort of, as an industry, need to have a reckoning with what the concept of roadmaps are doing to our product development processes. Of course, there is the venerable C. Todd Lombardo.
I was going to say, there's the book, Product Roadmaps Relaunched.
Yeah, I can't really talk about product roadmaps without talking about our C. Todd. Love that guy. And I think that the way that he teaches, he's got an incredible one-day workshop on product roadmaps, and I think he just sort of blows it out of the water in terms of course, and then he teaches it with Bruce McCarthy, who is another thinker in the space and another amazing trainer on the topic. But I think, any person who is going to be teaching you product roadmaps better be talking about those concepts of, shared understanding that comes from rigor and research, of the testing process that goes into filling what's coming up, and then the alignment piece that is an intrinsic part of road mapping.
Yeah, I think one of the things that any product manager, no matter what your level is, should be asking themselves is, how do things that are strategic priorities make their way into the roadmap?
That's great.
If you're new, what is the roadmap you inherited? How did the things that are on there get there?
Yeah.
And if you've been there for a while, just ask yourself, wait, how did these things really get here? And if it's, maybe some stakeholders who are like, I want this, go make it happen.
Yeah.
How can you understand that process and maybe map that out and look at how decisions flow through that organization? And again, kind of apply the product management process to the way that you work.
Yes.
Not
Process
just
engineering.
Yes,
Process
not just to the
engineering.
way that you build a product, but to the way that you work.
Yeah.
Because the organization is the product, right?
Yes.
Like at the end of the day, like a product, especially a software product, is a collection of decisions
Yeah.
that, based on who we are and how we work, will make it to the market.
Yeah.
Now, whether we're proud of those decisions or not, that's largely defined by the way that we engineer the processes and the relationships to get the right product to market, and defining what right is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that I've been kicking around as an idea is that in terms of roles in an organization, the process engineer is the product manager. Like, there isn't really anyone else who's doing that. I think upper management should be doing that. I don't think they are. I would love to see that happen more. I think as we see more and more heads of product or, chief product officers, I would like to see that, conversation bubble up a little bit more, but we're not seeing it right now. And I think product managers are really responsible for the process engineering piece. And again, your process is a product that you have to constantly be assessing. That's why critical thinking is such an insane skill for product managers to possess. And I think that understanding the system of your organization, again, should be, as like recalling back to that one of those first questions we answered, should be your first port of call in terms of entering any new organization. Is like, how are decisions being made? How do things work? What's the culture? What would I want to change if I could change anything? And again, constantly getting feedback on how it's going and checking in with people. And I think that's the amazing thing about the product manager role, is that there's so many different layers and levels of the way that we work. We're focused on the product, we're focusing on the process, we're focusing on our team, we're focusing on our stakeholders, we're focusing on the organization, and then we have society and culture to grapple with. That's why we need systems thinking and these kind of like visual models in order to parse it all, because it's so complex.
The one thing I'd add to that, just really quickly, is I think absolutely the product manager is thinking about all these things, but having a balanced team mindset can 100%. Definitely expand that, and drawing your team in so that you're not floating in the ether alone, is really important. You can't process engineer in a vacuum, and you can't engineer a process by yourself. You have to get messy and get real with people and be vulnerable at work, and pull in your designers, pull in your engineers. If you have program managers, project managers, product owners, stakeholders, managers, whoever, right? You might have customer service representatives. Pull those people in and let those teams, work with you and work together and just communicate to assess the situation and iterate on what's not working.
It's really what Essentials, our workshop, is all about. It's kind of like increasing your strategic impact as a product manager, how to use process as a strategic alignment tool. And doing that by bringing people into the process and letting them get their sticky fingers all over it is the best thing. All right. Thank you so much, Eli, for joining us today and for tackling some of those questions. I think the product road mapping question was a really fun one for us to talk about. I don't know if we necessarily answered his question, probably not, but again, there's no silver bullets to that. I want to say thank you so much to Mind the Product Training for sponsoring us. I want to thank Amy Roberts and Imogen, Laura, James Davenport, who's our filmer today, and Ross Baker, who is our kind of producer for all of this. Thank you so much. We will be listing out all the resources, books, and things that Eli and I talked about in each question in the line notes for the show. And if you have any questions about the workshops that Mind the Product Training does present, please feel free to email training@mindtheproduct.com, and somebody will answer your questions about what workshop is right for you. So we will see you again next time on Mindsets very soon. And send in your questions so we can grapple with them with our next amazing guest. Thank you guys. Thank you so much, Eli. You're the best.